Okay, so we are around about 12 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. We've still got a few people dialing in, but there are rather a lot of you, so we will crack on as we've only got the hour. So first of all, I'd like to welcome you all to very much on behalf of Governance Magazine and the Board Effectiveness Guild to this webinar about the effective board chair. My name is Leslie Stevenson. I'm the publisher of Governance and also of the Financial Times Board Director Programme, including the Financial Times Non-Executive Director Diploma. We're delighted to welcome so many of you to this seminar. I think that the interest it's gained has just shown how important this topic is. We all know that a good chair is absolutely vital. We've got four very experienced speakers, all from the Board Effectiveness Guild, who all undertake board reviews, and they're going to share with us the lessons that they've learned from real life, carrying out real life board effectiveness reviews. We're going to be looking at four topics: chairing the board, managing principal stakeholder relationships, the chair's key relationships, and succession planning. If we're going to run through all the presentations straight through, and then we'll take questions afterwards. So if you can pop questions in either the Q&A or the chat, and at the end of the presentations, I will ask them of the panelists on your behalf. So I do hope you enjoy it. With no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Ian White for the first session.
Thank you, Leslie, and welcome everyone. So I'm going to talk very briefly about chairing the board. The first thing I would say is that I think being a chair and being an effective chair is one of the most difficult things, and seeing somebody who's really good at it actually can be quite a rarity. So you know, I'm full of admiration for people who do this well and act as an effective facilitator of the board. And many of you will have experience of that, but it does make such a difference to the way the board operates if the chair is effective. And that's an obvious statement, but I sometimes think we forget that. I've talked in my slides, if I could go to the first slide, don't know if you've got that, Leslie. I've talked about value creating chairs, and that's very much because we talk about high performing boards, but actually the key is to be a value creating board and a value creating chair, and thinking about all of the different stakeholders. I'm not going to dwell on that because other people will be talking about different stakeholders after me, but it is something.
Ian, sorry, can I just stop you because something's gone wrong with the slides and I'm not quite sure what. There you go.
Okay.
Are you?
That's me.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Sorry.
That's no problem at all. So as I say, value enhancing, value creating chairs, I think are key to being an effective board. I think one of the big challenges of being a chair, and it's something that comes out of board reviews, is that you've got to constantly build and adapt the board. Many years ago, David Nadler wrote about, you know, the key function of a chair was to build the board, because the dynamics will constantly change as soon as somebody joins and somebody leaves. So it's not something that is a static role. It makes it all the more difficult. And certainly some of the boards that I've seen, the chair, particularly, for example, in the public sector, doesn't always have the freedom to build their own board, to actually select who's going to be on that board. So that makes it even more difficult. I've put, as Peter Drucker advocated about managers, you should, you know, the effective manager listens first and speaks last. And one of the things that really comes out for me with effective chairs are those who frame a matter, but then listen, and I've said listen again, and then speak if necessary after the matter's been discussed. I think that's really important, because if the chair jumps in with their views and comments first, that can really stifle the debate and influence other people. It shouldn't, but it does. And I would say about 50% of the chairs I look at actually do start speaking first and giving their opinion first. It's a much more effective discipline to make sure that you've carefully framed the matter, but then let there be a full debate. And that's not least because, and the next point that I make below, you know, if you're a really effective chair, you'll realise that the board meetings are only part of your role, and that you'll have partnered with the CEO and the executive team on different matters, and therefore you may well have discussed the agenda item in some detail with the CEO. So allowing your NEDs to come in, I think is really important. And on that point, I think another feature of effective chairs is to obviously remember that they are partnering with the CEO, but to actually try and take up less airtime than they might actually think is required, because you only get your NEDs there for quite a short time in terms of meeting space, and actually getting the real value from them, letting the other NEDs have plenty of airtime to discuss matters, I think is really valuable, particularly for the executives. So making sure that you partner with the CEO, but allowing the other NEDs to come in, and that you don't dominate the conversation. And I think finally, for the value creating chairs is to know that the time commitment is high, and mostly outside board meetings. I've done a number of reviews for a couple of particular chairs who've come from different sectors, and they've really made the time commitment, and it really shows a huge difference. They've got to know not just the board, but also the organisation as a whole. And I should think their time commitment was in their letter of appointment was advertised at about 50 days, but it ends up being much more than that. But the quality of the board, I think, is really enhanced by that. Certainly from the reviews I've done, I've seen some quite unhappy boards, and that's often been down to the chair not making the right time commitment. And one of the things you find as a board reviewer is that you often get the other NEDs complaining about that to you, rather than actually directly going to the chair, which of course they should. But it really does make a huge difference if the chair is making the time commitment. So it is a sizable commitment, as I think we'd all recognise, and there's a lot of work to do outside the board meeting. So just some quick tips on being a value creating chair. I think being an effective facilitator, and I'd say coach as well, but I think you're there really to facilitate the meetings and to act as a coach and mentor to the CEO and to some extent the other executives. And the boards, again, that I see work really effective are those where the chair is acting in that mentor capacity, and some of the other non-executives as well. I think gravitas without self-importance. I've done reviews for chairs when I've interviewed non-execs, and they said the real reason we've joined this chair is the board is because X chairs it, and we really respect them, we really value them. They've got the gravitas, but then they're not self-important. They're really inclusive and work well both for the non-execs and the execs. Get to know the NEDs and executives well. Again, another feature I often find with board reviews is that non-execs will say the chair doesn't know us sufficiently well. We don't know each other sufficiently well. But if he or she did, they would be able to bring us in better. So again, it's a real focus on that. And actually, it's a good point for social diversity as well. When you know each other's background, so just getting to know each other. So I would say build a board focusing on behaviours, not just skills. I always say to NEDs that skills are important, but dynamics and behaviours much more so. Exhibit integrity, courage. Courage can be sadly lacking both amongst NEDs and chairs, so it's something to focus for, and on judgment as well. So I think those three things that will make you both a successful chair and a successful NED. And again, constantly strive to enhance the board. One final point is if you are a chair of a board and you decide to sit in on some of the committees, remember the impact that can have on the committee chair. I've certainly seen examples of where the chair actually, the chair of the main board attends committees and is almost treated as the chair of the committee. So something to focus on. I'm going to leave it there and hand over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Stamp, and I'm going to talk today about the role of the chair in sort of wider stakeholder relationships and communication. I think this has been very much an emerging area in the last few years, partly on the back of the sort of ESG agenda, but I think also more specifically on the back of the focus around Section 172 of the Companies Act and the board's relationships with its key stakeholders. And certainly this has sort of flowed into the board reviews that many of us undertake to really understand, well, how is the board engaging with its key stakeholders? And for me, the chairs who do this well have a very strong understanding of their role in that sort of broader board engagement with its stakeholders. I think the sort of 4 key headings around that then are kind of being clear on how their relationship with stakeholders plays out, as opposed to maybe other members of the board, being clear on where the priorities are in those relationships, and understanding how the channels of communication might work and the sort of nature that the relationships might need to take. And I think one of the areas where good chairs are very clear will be in understanding what's the right sort of mix that they need for their particular board and for their particular role. There is no sort of one size fits all, I think, in this, and hopefully that will become clear as I just talk through this slide. So in terms of just understanding stakeholder relationships, I think the sort of first starting point for that is really being clear about the board's key stakeholders and who within the board needs to have, if you like, the lead position in the relationships with the company's key stakeholders. And I think there is sometimes a bit of a sense that those relationships are sort of homogenous across the whole board. In reality, I don't think that's the case at all. And quite often in some of those key stakeholder relationships, it's actually the executive leadership that need to take the lead. If you think in terms of maybe clients or suppliers or stakeholders that are very involved with the organization at a sort of detailed executive level, then it is going to be an executive leadership role. And I think recognizing that sort of primacy in the role of the executive means that the chair needs to be quite clear about where their priorities are therefore going to lie. And the priorities will be dependent as much on the circumstances of the organization as the role of the chair itself. So taking the sort of experience just gained from working with different PLCs over many years, I would say that the priority relationships for most chairs tend to focus on the 4 areas that I've listed on the slide. Firstly, relationships within the boardroom, which probably goes without saying, and I'm not going to comment on that as Alex will come on to that in the next slot. But there is invariably a priority relationship in relation to the owners of the business, whether that's large institutional shareholders or small shareholders, and even within that, the nature of that relationship may change. If, for example, you've got a controlling shareholder, that chair relationship may be a bit different to the relationship with you know, a 3 or 4% shareholder who's an institutional investor and who generally sees the executives most of the time. You'll have internal relationships with perhaps some of the key senior executives, or perhaps in a unionized business, employee reps, or even partner boards and so on in employee-owned business. And then I think there's a kind of an ambassadorial role for chairs in relation to the organization's license to operate, which may involve relationships with sort of with the regulators if you're in a regulated business, or sort of local communities, political leaders who are particularly involved in the areas that the organization participates in. And I think the good chairs are very sensitive to the right way of dealing with their stakeholders and the particular stakeholder relationships that they are feel responsible for. And that can operate at a number of different levels. I've just sort of highlighted 3 types here. One is just the relationship that is a personal one, i.e. they get to know their key stakeholders so that they can kind of be on the end of the phone or available if issues come up. But generally it's a kind of a relationship that's built around an understanding that they'll meet when they need to, but most of the time that may not be necessary. There will be other relationships built around periodic exchanges of information, which may be around a results time or an annual event of some sort that gives them an opportunity just to keep in touch without necessarily needing more than that, given the nature of the relationship. And then you'll have the much more involved relationships where it is a sort of more professional working relationship around planning projects or even problem solving if you've got particular issues that sort of come up between the organisation and that stakeholder. And I think those are the situations where chairs can be particularly effective in providing a kind of ambassadorial or mediatory role between with the particular stakeholder concerned. And I think finally, just understanding the channels of engagement and building on what I've just said is particularly important. Some aspects of chair engagement is really ambassadorial, maybe is about social interaction rather than sort of business interaction, and that may be just an annual sort of lunch or dinner or coffee or whatever. I think understanding the difference and the value of electronic versus face-to-face engagement has been a more perennial issue coming out of really since COVID and the challenges that faced, that threw up for not just individual interaction but also board interaction. And I think having sort of seen how boards have navigated their way through the sort of electronic versus face-to-face sort of discussion, I think it is good to be clear about when those types of intermediary, those types of engagement should be used. Electronic does work well when it's a matter of a sort of an uncomplicated catch-up. But I think where you do have difficult conversations, detailed conversations, and conversations where people don't really know each other well, then face-to-face is invariably better. And that's certainly the consensus that's come out of a lot of discussions I've had with boards over the last couple of years. And then there will be the formal sort of means of engagement, whether it's the AGM or some sort of internal town hall or other form of convened meetings. So I think that just gives you a sort of sense of the types of thinking that chairs, in my experience, good chairs will be going through as they think about their stakeholder relationships. And it's certainly not a sort of one-size-fits-all. I've seen chairs who have a very distant relationship with their shareholders purely because they don't need to have a particularly strong line of communication into shareholders if it's a small cap company where shareholders can be quite disengaged with what's going on if basically the company's performing well. On the other hand, you may have a lot of interaction with shareholders because you have to, because the relationships are tricky and there are particular issues that need to be dealt with. So I think that just sort of illustrates that there is no one size fits all, but what does the theme that runs through all good chairs in terms of stakeholder relationships is that clarity of thinking and that sort of very intentional understanding of how those relationships should work. With that, I'm going to conclude and hand over to Alex to talk about the internal key relationships.
Thanks, Chris. A chair, as we all know, is a non-exec position in a structure which looks like a team, but it isn't. It's a collaborative group, and it's a group with executive and non-executives and some built-in and very important tension between those two groups. The chair's art and the chair's role is to build relationships and to enable relationships that can ensure that challenge and support that we talk about all the time and in board reviews is the core of so much of the conversation around, does this board work or not? So the chair is the leader in the boardroom. Their job is to have the relationships with all board members, executive and non-executive, in order to ensure that there is open and productive discussion between all parties. The chairs that we see either can take their role in all sorts of different ways, driven by their own personality preferences. However, a weak chair can delegate their authority sometimes to the chief executive, and that's not necessarily a good thing. In the boardroom, the chair is the boss, but dominance and, you know, as Ian was talking earlier, ego-driven chairs do not enable that correct environment. What are the other critical relationships within the board then that actually matter? Well, to enable everything to work, you have your company secretary, and some boards, the company secretary is treated as not much more than an administrator. Good company secretary chair relationships where that is strong, they're working together on the building of the board agenda, etc. That's where the added value comes from there. If there is respect and trust in that relationship, then you get more value out of it. With the chief executive, the relationship is critical because it just transfers across that barrier of executive and non-executive. Chief executive and chair relationships need to be not just in the boardroom. There needs to be regular scheduled communication between the parties. There needs to be trust between them, and there needs to be respect for the difference of each other's accountabilities. And we'll come to that in a minute. 20 years ago, Derek Higgs introduced the senior independent director, and with some controversy at the time, they're now becoming a very, very common role on most boards. I personally am a fan of the SID role. I think it's a good insurance policy for when things go wrong. A good SID is there as an additional communication path for shareholders and other stakeholders if they are concerned about the performance of the chair, or indeed the performance of the chief executive. The SID is the person to go to. The SID is not a deputy chair, in my view, and certainly is not the chair in waiting. A good SID and a good relationship with the chair means that the chair can use them as a counterpoint, as someone to check things out with. And of course, the SID is there to evaluate the chair and to give effective feedback. As Chris has already mentioned, the chair has other responsibilities, both with external stakeholders and with internal members of staff. There has to be control and care taken in both those occasions because, again, we have a danger of the chair overstepping the mark and taking the executive leadership position, which should be held by the chief executive and the other executive directors. So what can we do about all this? Well, very quickly, firstly, from a board evaluation point of view, we're looking at the separation of accountabilities. Those things should be documented, the separation of accountabilities between the chair and the chief executive. That should be done whenever one or the other party changes, and it should be reviewed perhaps annually or biannually, or if some significant change has happened on the board. The process of making that document live is the most valuable thing rather than the document, in my view. The stakeholder management that Chris has been talking about from a chair's point of view and from a board point of view, if we've got a plan, then that controls the chair, the chair's activity somewhat, and it gives comfort to the other NEDs that they know where their role is, and they know what the chair is asking of them. The SID, we need them to be carrying out the review of the chair and giving useful, honest feedback, not just playing to the ego of the chair. Good SIDs that we've seen in role are able to really talk frankly and talk, truth to power with the chair, and they earn their value on those situations. The one thing we have seen, and Ali will talk more detail on succession plans, but we see the kind of Alex Ferguson effect, the very effective chair who's been there for quite a long time, getting to the end of their tenure, and resisting the plans for replacement. It's dangerous, it's difficult, and it risks the effective ongoing dynamic of the board. So we want to see good succession plans, and we want to see them early in place, and we want to see the SID actually pushing that, so that the chair can have an effective legacy from their tenure, but that can be handed on to the next person. And then the last thing that chairs need to be doing is running NED-only sessions, okay, either before or indeed after board meetings, in order for the NEDs to have an opportunity to discuss the agenda, to discuss the issues that are coming up on the board meetings, and to build those relationships between the NEDs. Some chief executives hate this. Okay, they go, well, why are all the NEDs talking on their own? But we take the view that executive directors have plenty of time to talk on their own in their own executive meetings, and it is only right and fair that the chair should have some time with their NEDs on their own. There are opportunities through board dinners to extend that and to have the whole board together in order to have an extended time to build relationships and to build levels of trust, and for board members to understand the motivations of each other in the board, in joining that board, and therefore use the capabilities across the board. As I say on the slide, relationships that enable the effectiveness of the chair are hard won and easily destroyed, and we've seen plenty of examples where the wrong language, the wrong approach taken by the chair in the boardroom really damages things, and that it damages both the willingness of the NEDs, the COSEC, the executives to contribute. If that happens, we have imported risk into the board process, and we can't have that. So let's move on this. Ali, you're up next, taking this point on succession planning further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So I wanted to talk about succession planning and also composition of the board, and just a few key points, really. Leslie, could you move the slide on, please? So from a succession planning point of view, I think the first thing that I would say is, in all my sort of 10 years of experience of doing board effectiveness reviews and working with boards, succession planning is a topic that frequently comes up in a board review. Usually it's aired because there's some concern about when the conversation of the chair's succession will start to happen, or often the CEO will say, well, my succession is never discussed, and I would like it to be. I would value that. So often the conversation is started in a board review because there's an anxiety that the conversation isn't been had. So the first thing that I often recommend to boards is that it's really important for chairs, when they start their role as chair, to just normalise conversations about succession. And it's really helpful if you can authorise your HR, head of HR or your head of talent to work with you as chair to really bring good practice in terms of conversations about succession planning into the boardroom. They'll have a lot of skills and tools that will help to make those conversations normal. They can be discussed as part of the annual performance development conversation. So really focusing on career. And I think conversation has to have two parts to it. So the first is about looking forward, what's right for the organisation from the perspective of the chair's succession, the CEO's succession, and non-executive, all the non-exec directors' succession. So what's right for the organisation? What does the organisation need? And also what's right for each individual, and finding the sweet spot between those two things. But if those conversations are had annually, at the very least as part of that review conversation, and also at the nomination committee, often led by the chair, but increasingly we find that the nomination committee chair might be someone different from the chair. Chairs give up that position sometimes reluctantly, and obviously when their succession is being discussed, then someone else must chair that discussion. But it can be very helpful to the chair to have somebody else chairing the nomination committee. It can help to oil and make more fluid those conversations about succession planning. Timing and continuity really matter in succession planning. It's very unusual and very unhelpful if the CEO and the chair change at the same time. So really being clear about personal agendas as well as the organizational needs is critical. And if there's a hierarchy in those two, of course, the organization's need must be first and foremost. And then secondly, I wanted to just make this sort of the final point really about non-exec turnover. So typically we would expect the maximum term of a chair to be 9 years. And most typically people think of that in terms of 3 times 3 years, and the same for non-execs. However, increasingly, particularly with the pace of change, we might find that the organisation needs different skills, and therefore the board may need to accept that non-exec tenure, chair tenure, CEO tenure wouldn't necessarily be for that full 9-year term. So we should be looking very much as succession planning being a normal conversation, part of the board's work. It's critical that it's just a conversation that happens. And if you can really work hard with the head of talent or head of HR, you can bring that skill and straightforwardness to a conversation that doesn't need to be difficult. If it's left too late, typically that's when it becomes an issue. Leslie, could you move the slide on, please? So thinking a little bit about how you create an inclusive, competent and diverse board. Again, a key factor is to discuss diversity. Often when I review boards and we focus on how inclusive is this board, a good and effective chair will create an environment where people feel equal and open to speak about the things that really concern them. They can share their thoughts and feelings in an open and transparent way, and the dialogue is deep and effective in terms of covering off the most important issues. But one topic that often doesn't get discussed properly and effectively is actually, how do you know how diverse your board actually is? Do you know other board members well enough to know their cognitive diversity, their gender diversity, ethnic diversity, background diversity? So diversity takes on many forms, and really having conversations that allow you to actually know how diverse your board is the critical starting point. I think it's crucial that boards develop themselves. I'm really happy to say that over the last 5 years, I've seen a lot more boards across multiple sectors actually investing time in developing their work, the way that they work together, their dynamic, and they use much more sophisticated ways to develop themselves, which is refreshing and certainly hasn't been the case in the past. I think it's helpful when you're thinking about developing diversity and developing an inclusive board to use profiling tools. Many of you may have used these in your executive career, and I tend to focus on two specific aspects. So one is to focus on values, measuring values. Values and beliefs strongly held can often be at the root of good, cognitive diverse conversation, but it can also be at the root of difference and finding challenges in resolving differences. So understanding how different individuals' values show up and how the organisation's values show up and how the board values show up is really a helpful thing to do as a kind of basic place to start. And then the second area to focus on, which Ian talked about right at the start, is board behaviour. So do we really, are we developing how we interact with each other? Because if we do focus on the board's ability to think strategically, to involve people effectively, to inspire and communicate in an inspirational way, and to measure and monitor performance, if we really focus on those 4 specific areas, we can really develop a board with a much stronger sense of leveraging individual perspectives and driving good outcomes. So I'm a big believer that board development should be part of the board agenda, and it should be comprehensive, and it should focus to start with on getting to know each other at a much deeper level. And once you start on that journey, you can really start to find effectiveness will change. Of course, it's a continuous development process, and it aids succession planning inevitably, because with more knowledge about each other and more knowledge about the organisation, you can think much more clearly about what the organisation needs from the board in the future. Thank you. Leslie.
Thanks very much indeed, Ali, all of you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because we don't need the slides up, and ask all the panelists to put their videos on again. David Archer didn't present on this, but he is here. He is part of the Board Effectiveness Guild, and he is going to take part in the panel. I see we've got some questions up already. I see one's in the chat. I'm not sure the chat is actually working on this. So if you have got a question, please can you put it in the Q&A? And I will now put some of the questions to the panelists. So first question I've got on my screen is, what's the best approach for an NED to take if the chair is poor and there is no SID?
Well, I take that. I suppose it kind of picks up on the SID role. You can understand why Derek Higgs designed the SID, really. And that's why from board effectiveness point of view, I'm a real fan of it. If the SID is not being appointed and you're an NED on a board, you're much more exposed, really, in this circumstance. If you can't go straight to the chair and provide feedback to the chair, then the only alternative you really have in practice, I'm interested to know what others think, is to go to other NEDs, because if you're finding a problem with the chair, you can be normally sure that the other NEDs will too, and then if there are NED-only opportunities, then take that to the chair. But without a SID, you are much more limited in your options. Hence, our strong advice to make sure that there is a SID appointed for each at each board. I don't know what other people would how they would add to that.
No, I was just going, because I'm about to. Sorry, I have to leave. I mean, I think the only thing I would say is, and I think it comes back to what you referred to, Alex, in the Higgs report, is that I think Higgs said, being on a board is not necessarily a comfortable place, and nor should it be. And sometimes, boards should be about, candor, and in many ways, the best thing is to approach the chair.
Yeah.
We've all had experiences as board reviewers where actually it's left to us to pick up on problems of the chair, and people not to do that directly. And I think it's really important, if you're on the board, to remember that it can be difficult. There's some difficult things to do, and one of them may be to actually have that I accept difficult discussion with the chair. Sorry, Ali.
No, not at all. I think I was just going to say that I think it's really important as a non-exec to be really clear in your own mind about what you expect from the chair, but also to remember that that might not be what the chair thinks their job is. So, as to Alex and Ian's points, grown-up conversations and the ability to be able to have really straight talking conversations about that. But also, the tip I would often say is when you approach those type of conversations, start with a bit of a hypothesis, and don't start straight in there from the point of view of, well, from my point of view, you're not a very good chair, and I think you need to be different. But start from the point of view of, some of the things that you expect from a chair, and open it up as a conversation rather than being judgmental straight away. And that will lead you probably to much more of an effective relationship, but also to start to drive, hopefully, change and development. Because people often just have different views and different expectations.
Thank you very much, everybody. We've had a couple of questions in there asking if the slides are going to be circulated. So as long as all our participants are happy for them to be circulated, yep, we're very happy to do that. And another question about someone's having troubles with their connectivity and asked if there's going to be a video. We have been recording this. We will have to edit it slightly because you might notice at the beginning I made a mistake and wanted to have a look at the participant list, and you all could have come up on the screen, forget it was my screen being shared. So we will take that out, and then we will circulate the video. So then Elias has asked, do detailed conversations have to be face-to-face, or can they be on phone or Zoom if there is a bias towards face-to-face as it's what they are historically used to?
Shall I answer that, Leslie?
Thank you.
I think the answer is it really does depend. The point I suppose I was making is really to understand the differences in the different types of communication channel. I think one of the points that came through very clearly to me, certainly in some of the reviews I did sort of in the aftermath of COVID, was how much the sort of the Zoom Teams meeting really did actually impede certain aspects of board discussion and sort of board development. And it was put very well by one person I interviewed who, when we were talking about the differences between the Zoom and face-to-face, they said, well, face-to-face is always much better where you've got really complex issues, where you've got issues with people you don't know well, and where you can kind of get the full range of communication, not just what's sort of said on screen. And really where there's confrontation as well, and there's difficult conversation. And so I think, if you've got a very easy conversation and you're dealing with someone you know well, then online and is always going to be a reasonably safe medium. And also it's a question of what people are used to as well. So if you've got people who are preferring to sort of meet in person, then obviously it's going to be helpful to sort of choose a favourable medium rather than an unfavourable one. So it's a little bit of a it depends argument, but I think the nature of the conversation will be very important in determining actually what is a good way to engage and what's not.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone else want to add anything, or I'll move on to the next question, which is, what difference have you observed for chairing not-for-profits and charities? Alex or David, do you want to answer that? Alex?
Yeah, I mean, in not-for-profit sector, what attracts people to the role. It kind of builds on something that Ali was talking about values, and the kind of values discussion is kind of perhaps more in bright colours, really, in a not-for-profit setting. So and that can mean that people can be very emotionally connected to the purpose of the organisation in a way that may be less so in, you know, kind of in a chair of a, you know, a normal corporate. So that passion can be both valuable, but sometimes can cloud some of the difficult issues that large charities have to handle. I don't know if other people have seen stuff.
Just to add that, I absolutely agree with Alex's points. Would also say that in our experience, in fact, we did some surveys of seeing just the sheer size of boards, and typically charity boards are much larger than PLC boards or public sector boards. One of the consequences of that is there's just less airtime to go around, so the chair has a more difficult kind of managing airtime role. One of the things that we've seen work well to counter that is actually to make much more use of committees, and therefore, if you've got more people in the boardroom, actually, how can you get best value out of them? Well, maybe in more committee work, but then of course the chair has to be very good at delegating the responsibility for chairing those committees. So I think that's another significant difference.
Definitely.
Thank you, David and Alex. And someone's asked, from your experience, what 3 KPIs on board effectiveness would you advise boards to consider and or to reflect on? Have you got 3 KPIs? Can you say that?
I could say, I think I focus on particularly measures of openness. So are there issues that aren't being discussed? So I would really want to measure the level of openness that transparency that there is in the board. And I think that's absolutely key, because boards are effectively very dependent on trust. So measuring that sense of behaviour is really important. Well, that would be my top one, I think I would start with. So maybe I'll let other people add to.
I think, I mean, it's related to what Ali has said. I think challenge, but making sure that is constructive challenge. And I would say nearly every board I review, the challenge could be greater. And it's normally the executives saying that they would welcome more challenge from the non-executives to make sure that there is that constructive challenge. I think another thing would be ensuring that there is sufficient level of debate, and a lot of boards will have presentations where presenters will read through their presentation, and therefore the meetings are one very long, and secondly there isn't really room for really in-depth discussion. So I think that when I see boards that actually have short presentations and allow discussion to take place, I think that's good. And I'm bound to say, I think we'd all have seen this quality of papers and length of papers. I mean, for those of you who do work in the financial services sector, I mean, you can see board packs of 1,000 pages, and just trying to get through that is hugely difficult. So I mean, there's a saying I think a lot of us use from Mark Twain, is or adapting from Mark Twain or someone like that, saying I wanted to write a short paper, but I only had time to write a long one. And I think the quality of papers and highlighting issues would be my other one. I must go.
Raise the hand.
I guess I would say listening. I think it underpins behaviourally, underpins the effectiveness of any group of people who are trying to do something together. So quality of listening rather than speaking. It seems to me, kind of, we're really after, in order to get that challenge and support working across that boundary in boards, there has to be relationship. The relationship has to have some trust in it. The trust is built by people believing they will be listened to, they will have space.
I think for me it's about I agree with everything my colleagues have said, but I think it's about how does the board engage with the external environment, the internal environment, and bring that all together in really collectively engaging with the direction of the business. And so how it engages with strategy, how it engages with performance is a very key part of that, and that's certainly something I am always very interested in looking at. But I think the quality of that comes out of all of the other things that my colleagues have talked about in terms of, you know, contribution, engagement, and so on and so forth. So you know, it's kind of, is the board really sort of scratching the itch, or is it sort of just talking about other things that aren't so important?
Thank you. David, did you want to just have a final word on that?
Leslie, are we able to save some of the questions? I don't suppose we'll get through them all and we could answer.
We will. Yeah, I was just thinking that, Ian. So yes, the Zoom will capture all the questions. So any we don't get round, so I might abbreviate some of the ones that are coming up. And then any we don't get round to, we can try and answer afterwards.
Right, I must leave now. All right, bye.
Okay, so shall we move on? So what can a NED do if there is little progress on achieving organisational change in spite of repeated efforts?
Resign.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
I mean, it depends on what, I think it depends on what your repeated efforts are. But I mean, and I would come back to Ian's point that being a non-exec is a tough job, and you are there for the good of the long term of the organisation. And if you are truly interacting and influencing and being very clear and straightforward in what you see that isn't happening, and you're not making progress, then I think it really is important actually for you to say, well, I'm clearly not adding any value, so I'm going to stand down, because you it's not okay to sit on a board and then say afterwards, oh well, I knew it wasn't really changing sufficiently enough. You need to hold yourself to account, I think, and it can be a tough thing to do because it's quite hard to know when enough is enough. But I think being really tough with yourself and saying, am I adding value? Is this going how I want it to? And if it's not, then you really need to move on and be happy about that. You know, maybe it just wasn't the right place for you to add value, and you'll add value somewhere else.
I absolutely agree.
Just to
it's the most important.
Sorry, just to build on what Ali was saying, but perhaps slightly to counter the question. If part of the question was about, if you like, internal organisational change, there's a risk that as an ed you get too involved in the executive side of that. I mean, as an ed, you own the strategy, the executive own the execution of that strategy, and you might like to think you know a better organisational structure as a way of doing that, but actually it's for the executive to carry the responsibility for that, and you to scrutinise whether that is achieving the strategic aims. So sometimes you see NEDs getting drawn down into the details of internal organisational change to an extent which is getting to executive.
Thank you. And then you've mentioned interaction with HR, and this person's pointing out that most of the focus on governance tends to be on CEO and company secretary, or chair and company secretary. And they're asking, do companies make sufficient use of HR? Are people skills undervalued compared with financial skills?
Well, I mean, I'd say you definitely need both, but typically boards haven't used HR to great effect. But if I think about the boards that I've reviewed that I think are really effective, they do use the HR or head of talent to help them with the most important people aspects of the board. And when you see it done well, it makes sense.
Absolutely.
You know, so yeah, there is too much emphasis on corporate governance being about finance, but that doesn't mean that should be dialed down. It means that the people aspect should be dialed up.
I agree. I mean, one of the things that we see over time is, and actually less so now, is the kind of the quality of time and attention given at the nominations committee, and you know, kind of more time there, with more good quality HR input, which gives the kind of time and the space to talk about that stuff and to extend that remit. And even seeing boards where they're adding the kind of, you know, the people agenda much more actively into the norms or the REMCOM. So extending the time available to it, giving more time to the HR director to make real contribution to board governance through those places. That's happening more, and we're certainly have encouraged it in a number of places, really. So it's, to Ali's point, it's kind of, it's in addition, it's not instead of.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, and certainly in my experience, I think whilst you don't want to sort of bypass your CEO or CFO, you know, unnecessarily, I think good boards quite often have, you know, good company secretary, an independent-minded company secretary, and quite often very strong people director or HR. And I think particularly in REMCOs, it's great to have a people director talking to CEO pay than the CEO himself talking to CEO pay, because it does just bring a slightly more independent sort of perspective on it. And if a board, if non-execs can feel confident that they are dealing with an HR director who, you know, knows what they think, is giving them good information, I think it really does help. And then that can extend into non-co and succession planning and so on and so forth.
Thank you. So, question about the independence of the chairman. Some smaller businesses look at equity as a good way to bring in talent when they're short on capital, but there are also challenges with the independence. And what's the board's view on that? Or should I say panel's view on that?
I think it's a very there's probably a lot of aspects to this particular discussion, and we operate in the UK in an environment where shareholding and independence, I think, is seen in a certain way by investors. And certainly as you get into small cap and sort of AIM companies and, you know, what you might call more entrepreneurial companies, this sort of linkage between equity and sort of board membership becomes perhaps a more clouded issue. I suppose at the end of the day, it's sort of about character and judgment, as the UK Corporate Governance Code talks about. But, you know, if you got some skin in the game because you've got some shares, but actually at the end of the day, you're able to be a non-exec who operates perfectly independently of short-term decisions or anything like that, then, you know, theoretically that should be fine. But you know, we do live in a world where there's this sort of perception versus reality dilemma, and it's very difficult to sort of give a hard and fast answer on that. But you know, I think you have to be mindful that how people perceive it is sometimes the dominant driver of opinion.
Brilliant. Well, we're coming right up against it. We've got lots more really interesting questions. So we will try and get back to you on those, and we'll try and send those around when we send the slides around. Just very finally, because this one I think is really interesting. One of my board has a government-sponsored apprenticeship scheme in operation to bring on younger and more diverse candidates. Does the panel have a view on whether these work well, or are there other ways of getting a more mixed intake? If I could ask you to be brief, but we'd really be interested in all of your views on that. Okay,
I'll start. I've seen government board apprenticeships work extremely well, and I've seen them work for minority groups and giving both the experience of those individuals, and on the best boards, they've really treated those apprenticeships as kind of sort of semi-NEDs, and have really made the time and valuable. And I've seen individuals going through those schemes and actually having very, very useful and valuable board membership careers thereafter. So I'm a fan.
I think young people often have a beautiful mental freedom, so they contribute
Completely.
in a way, perhaps some of us older generation don't.
Yeah.
So I'm fully in favour of it.
Yeah.
I think I'm a fan. I think you need to be clear about what it is doing and what it's not doing, and everyone else needs to be clear. I think it has a particular value in an environment where, you know, there's a lot of older board directors in organizations that actually in very much sort of millennial and Gen Z sort of activities. And so understanding your customers through that sort of medium seems to me to be a jolly good idea.
Last word to you, David.
Well, I would just really agree with all that my colleagues have said. Nothing else to add on that point. But as a last word, I'm conscious we haven't made as much as perhaps we might about the linkage between being an effective chair and running an effective board review. And actually, one of the things I would like to say is the most effective chairs I see really use those board reviews, not just to improve the performance of their whole board, but to improve their own performance. And so just kind of wanted to leave that as a closing remark, that actually chairs can get a lot of value themselves from board reviews as another means of kind of feedback and developing their own expertise.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to thank all the panelists. That was an absolutely fascinating session. And thank you all for your questions. There were some really excellent questions. And it may take us a few days to get back to you, but we will get back to you with the slides, with the video, and try and answer all the questions that we weren't able to answer on the actual call. Thank you all so much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed that and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot.